Alright, so I've done a base coat in my canvas. We're just doing a sky and we're going to add some clouds with a palette knife. So I started at the top with ultramarine blue, which is a bit darker, and then transitioned adding a little bit of white with ultramarine blue, then some cobalt, and then some cobalt with white. So I have some cobalt blue here, as well as some ultramarine blue in my palette. And some titanium white, as well as some Mars black and a little bit of primary yellow. Those are all the colors that we'll be needing for this painting. So I've done this base coat in a paintbrush just to make sure that the grain of the canvas is really covered, because we don't want any of the white texture of the canvas to come through. But now we can just take some paint and just make sure it's applying to all of our, to the full back of the palette knife, and then you can just kind of spread it. It's kind of like decorating a cake, if you've ever done that. It's really similar. And since we've already added a base coat with the paintbrush, you don't need to worry about covering the full thing. You can just let some of that darker color shine through. You can do a little bit on the sides and the edges as well, so you can see that texture difference there. And you can mix with your palette knife directly, but I like to just use a paintbrush just to have a little bit more control. So you can mix some of the cobalt blue and some of the ultramarine blue together. And you can just brush it on if you want, or you can dip your palette knife in here. And the nice thing about working with the palette knife is just to keep that abstract style, you don't really need to rinse your brush or rinse your palette knife at all. You can just kind of blend and keep the color from that's previous on it, just kind of keep that and mix it together. And with acrylic painting, it's all about layers, so if you make a mistake, you can just paint over it. It's not really a big deal. So you will find using a palette knife that you are going to go through more paint, just because of it kind of coats on a little bit thicker. Like I said, it's kind of like icing, and you're just kind of spreading it. With the metal one, like I said, you can press a little bit harder to really spread the paint out thinner, but I could also leave it on thicker like this. I have kind of a thicker blob down here in the bottom. So you can choose how thick or thin you want the paint to be just by applying a little bit more pressure and kind of spreading it around. And you can kind of use both sides of the palette knife, which is really cool. So something cool that you can do is with a kind of dry palette knife that doesn't have much paint on it, is you can kind of scrape away excess paint and allow the base layer of the canvas to show through. So that's why it's kind of nice to do that base layer first, so that you have a color underneath and you don't just have that white canvas showing through. Don't forget to do the edges as well. And you can do a lot of the mixing just directly on the canvas, which is really nice. And just same the way that you would blend with a paintbrush, it's just all about layering colors over top of each other so that it blends and looks a little bit more natural. But since it's abstract, it doesn't need to look perfect. It doesn't need to look realistic. It can look as realistic as you want it to be. So I'm just kind of scraping it with the edge, and that's kind of letting it blend together. Don't forget about the edges, just like with any painting. If you're working on canvas, you want to make sure that you're adding some of that color and texture along the sides as well. So once you're happy with the sky and you've added texture, you can just wipe off the paint on a rag really easily. You don't need to wet it or do anything like that. And then you can just start adding a little bit of white for your clouds. So you can just kind of map it out. With the clouds, you can add a little bit more paint just to make it a bit thicker and fluffier, and you can just kind of dab it. You can spread it out a little bit more too if you want. You can have a little bit of area showing through where the sky is. It's just about kind of moving quickly, dabbing. Just to kind of get that kind of abstract shape in there. Then with my brush, I'm just going to add a little bit of Mars Black to the white, and I can kind of mix it a bit in my palette just to kind of add some shading. I can also mix directly on the canvas as well. And just keep the shadows towards the bottom of the clouds. When you're making clouds, you can have them all different sizes. You can have some areas that are more transparent, some areas that are thicker. So you can put another smaller one over here. You can look at a picture of clouds if you want, just to kind of get started. You can do as many clouds as you want, and different size clouds, different thickness of clouds as well. You can also add a little bit of yellow where the sun is kind of shining through, and that will kind of warm up your clouds a little bit. It helps to kind of wait in between layers as well, especially if you really don't want some of that background showing through, or you can just put the paint on a little bit thicker. But with clouds, it's kind of nice having some areas where the background is shining through, just to make them look a little bit more kind of fluffy and soft. You can take some of the smudges with your fingers and it'll just kind of soften up the edges as well. You could use like a rag or a sponge as well. You don't need to do it with all of it, but just some areas can just be softened a little bit. And you can always go back over with your palette knife if you want. And before you do a full painting on a canvas like this, you can always practice on a piece of watercolor paper or in your sketchbook, and that way you don't need to worry about wasting any supplies, and it's just a good way to practice. But if you feel like you're ready to start on a canvas, then I just encourage you to do it. So what I have done is I have let this painting dry overnight. With palette knife painting, it does take a little bit longer to dry because the paint is a bit thicker. You can see that it's a bit globby in some areas and really nice and textural. And the reason for letting painting with a palette knife dry fully in between layers is so that you don't lose the layer underneath. So I've painted this upper part in ultramarine blue, and now I'm going to add a lighter blue cobalt over top. And since this is dry, the lighter blue is going to rest on top and it's going to let some of the darker areas shine through. Whereas if I would have painted right when the paint was still wet, I could have ended up scraping off the dark blue. I could have ended up mixing the colors together. So it's really good just to let it dry and kind of have patience with your palette knife painting. So I'm going to make this darker blue. I'm going to add some lighter blue to it. I'm going to add some more white and some more gray to my clouds so that there's less blue showing into some of the gaps. And then my painting should be done. So it's important to remember that in acrylic painting, you can definitely paint in layers and keep adding to your painting. It can always be a work in progress, and that's really good for your skill development. So let's get started. We're just gonna get some of this lighter cobalt blue on my palette knife, and I'm just gonna start spreading it in sections. I don't need to cover it completely. I like having some of these darker bits shine through. And don't forget about the edges of your canvas if you are painting on a canvas. You want that to have a nice consistent look. So I can use both sides of my palette knife, the front and the back, and that kind of thins out the paint, because with the sky I want it to be more of a thinner, kind of smoother surface, and my clouds can be more thick and textural. So make sure you get right up to the edges. And again, don't forget about the sides of the canvas. So I'm just adding it on and then I'm smoothing it out with the other side. So any area that you're not happy with, you can just add another layer and cover it up. That's the real nice thing about acrylic painting with a brush or with a palette knife. Alright, so that looks better already. It's more of a consistent, even color, which looks good. So you can always wipe off your palette knife like this. So now I'm going to add some white to our clouds. I have a little tiny bit of blue on my palette knife, which is fine. So this is just going to cover up some of the blue that was showing through, make my clouds a little bit more puffier and fuller. And to do kind of finer bits, I'm using more of the tip of my palette knife and less of the full side. So that's how I can kind of paint those smaller details in. So with a palette knife, it kind of helps to move quickly and don't worry about things looking too realistic. You can paint on the edges as well. If you have less paint on your palette knife, it's going to kind of create a similar look to dry brushing, where it kind of becomes transparent or really thin, so that can kind of look like clouds that are in the distance. And I'm just going to do the same with my gray paint as well, so I'm just mixing it directly in my palette. And I can add some gray back in for my shadows under the clouds. And you can add a little bit of yellow as well, just to kind of add some warm tone to the clouds, make it look like the sun is shining through. Add a bit of white to it so it's more of a real pale, soft yellow. And you can just add it into some sections. Gives the clouds a little bit more dimension as well. And then you can always add a bit more white over top if it's too yellow. So if you want, you can always use your finger and kind of smooth out some of the edges, some of those softer bits of the cloud. Especially ones that are more in the distance. Alright, so I think this painting is done. I think it looks really good, and it just helped kind of waiting in between the layers to let the paint dry so that I could have some of the darker bits shine through, and so that I had a nice kind of base coat on my clouds and I could add to it. Remember, when you're painting clouds, it's good to kind of have different size of clouds, clouds that are thinner, wider, smaller bits attaching them. You can have clouds overlapping as well. Again, take some photos of clouds on a cloudy day, and that's a good kind of starting point to work with. but I think painting clouds with a palette knife is just a really good introduction to using a palette knife if you have never used a palette knife before. So I would love to see your cloud paintings, so you can tag me on Instagram at Jackie Partridge Art, and please use the hashtag Jackie Partridge Art Classes. I'd love to comment on them and see what you're making, share them to my page as well. Again, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, hit the bell for notifications. And if you want exclusive painting videos that aren't shared on YouTube, you can join my special members list and sign up on my email list, jackiepartridge.com/shop. And all the links for this video are in the description below. Thanks and have a great day. Happy painting.